Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate this epic set of 16 trees. So first up is this ombré paintbrush design. The first thing I'm doing is piping on piping consistency. This is somewhere between a soft and a medium peak. Doesn't really matter which one you use. And I'm kind of messily just piping this on and doing a little bit of an intersection in between the two different colors to kind of help that ombre look along. You're ultimately going to use a paintbrush on top of this, so you really don't need to worry about how neat it is. There is a balance though in how much icing you use. There is such a thing as too much, and there's such a thing as too little. You can always add more and you can always take it off, but just keep that in mind. So I am using this flat brush from Borderlands Bakery. I will link these brushes in the description of this video. And I'm just kind of messily painting the color. I want the look to be kind of rustic and textured and messy, so it works. I did clean off my brush just a little bit because I had too much icing on the end of my brush, and as I'm doing this, I'm starting off by just brushing the pure color itself and then going into the section that kind of blends it together. I wasn't going for a super meticulous ombre, just kind of a blend in between the two colors, so this really worked for me, and I just chose to go from dark to light. You could probably go from light to dark, whatever makes the most sense to you. It is super helpful to pick a paintbrush that really fits the size of the design, and for me this was perfect. It wasn't too big, it wasn't too small. So cleaning up these little bits to make sure I don't have too much icing, and I'm getting the nice ombre between the colors, the good texture that I'm going for. And now I'm spritzing edible glitter. It is the Sugar Art Diamond Dust in White. I'll link that in the description. My absolute favorite edible glitter. And there we have the ombre paintbrush. So up next is the dot knife cookie, as I lovingly call it. This is easy, but it's time consuming, especially the way I did it because I alternated colors. If you want to take less time on this design, don't alternate colors like I did. Do yourself a favor, just do maybe one color for each row or one color for the entire tree. That works too. So I'm alternating medium peak piping consistency here. I think the medium peak is important so it still really maintains integrity in between all of the dots. A soft peak you could get away with for sure. A stiff peak I think would just be, it would be too stiff, but actually if you're going to do anything, go on the stiffer side than the thinner side. And here I am piping these nice big dots. I'm not being really meticulous about making sure that they are smoothed out. If I wanted to be, maybe I could take a scribe and kind of settle out the dots before doing the pull with the knife, but y'all know me at this point. I only have so much patience, and that was a level of patience that I just wasn't willing to have. So I left the dots kind of textured, and I like the end look, so we good. In this case, I just want to say that I edited out all of the transitions here. So this is moving probably twice as fast as it actually did in real time. It's still real-time speed of me moving, but every time I switched that bag and cleaned off my knife in between, I just wanted to take that out because y'all, we ain't got time for that. This video is long enough. So I'm actually just using a kitchen knife here. I was going to use my offset spatula, but when I went to make this, I realized my offset spatula was too big. So the best tip I had was my kitchen knife. I didn't love it just because the end of it wasn't totally rounded, but It was good enough. This tree looks great. So use your kitchen knife. If you have a mini offset spatula, that's what I need to get, then use that. Or use the end of a very small teaspoon. You want to make sure that whatever you're using matches the size of the dots that you're pulling. And what I do love about this design is that it is done in one step. So once I am finished doing all of these dots, this cookie is done. There's no drying in between layers. It is done, done, done. You could add maybe some diamond dust on top of this to add some extra sparkle, but I wanted to just leave it as is. It is a good amount of icing, so if you don't like cookies with a lot of icing, something to keep in mind. But I'm just going for beauty at this point. And the last little guy at the top is probably the hardest. Cleaned off just a little bit of the extra. And that is the knife dot cookie. Up next, we have the negative space line tree. For this and almost all of the trees in this set, I am doing a 1 consistency outline and flood. That means that I'm using the same consistency to both outline and flood the cookie. It is what I call a thick flood, which if you're doing seconds is somewhere in the region of a 20-second flood. I don't use seconds anymore. I base it off of how the icing falls off the spoon. So a thick flood for me just barely falls off the spoon into the bowl in a continuous trickle. A thin flood will just fall right off in a stream right off of the spoon quite quickly, but this just barely comes off. And what that does is that it is thin enough that it will settle flat. Sometimes it needs some encouragement, but it is thick enough that as long as you're applying the right amount of icing to the cookie, it will not actually fall off the sides of the cookie. Now, I certainly still have plenty of times when I get a little spillage and I have to fix it, and that's just part of decorating cookies. So I've allowed that to really thoroughly crust, and now I'm moving on to the most time-consuming part of this cookie. Buckle up, this took me about 10 minutes. It is not for the faint of heart. A lot of people have said, oh man, I can't believe you use a projector, what patience, but actually the projector and using this image saved me so much. What this allows me to do is to actually pipe one color at a time instead of one line at a time. I'm alternating the colors every third color to get the ombre look that I have with my greens here. So I'm piping every third line. If I was not using a projector, I'd have to pipe one line at a time so I can really get the right spacing in between the lines. The image that I'm using here is I just found a stock photo of lines on Google, and then I took that photo, and on my iPad I actually just drew out that triangular tree that you see in the middle. Super simple. I lined it up with the lines to make sure I was going to get just the right tree shape. Pardon my slowness sometimes. Sometimes it takes me a minute to find my words to describe everything. So what can I say about what I'm doing right now? Piping straight lines is hard. I am using what looks like a medium peak piping consistency. I'm fairly certain that all of my piping consistency throughout this entire set is a medium peak. I did that because I had a variety of types of details that I was doing, and sometimes for me a soft peak doesn't hold its shape quite well enough, at least the soft peak I do, for all of the detail that I want to do. So to pipe lines straight, you really want to lift the bag off the cookie and guide the icing. What I'm doing right here is when I start the line, there's a little bit of a bead, and I want to make the lines look like they melt into the cookie. I'm able to really cut the line off when I end it on the other side, but starting it's a lot harder, so that's why I was taking that scribe to kind of cut off the beginning of the line. Now, that is a level of meticulousness, friends, that I don't normally do, and you certainly do not need to either. But I just had this vision for this cookie, and I wanted to look as perfect as I possibly could. So I took the extra time to use that scribe to cut off the beginning. And honestly, I'm really glad I did, because I do think that it helped to add to that seamless look of all of the lines. So back to piping straight lines. It all starts with how you're holding your bag, and I always have a point of contact on the table, and that's super important, and you need to figure out what's most comfortable for you. Is it your elbow? Is it your arm just above your elbow? Is it your mid arm? What is that part of your arm called? I don't know. But the part of your arm between your elbow and your hand. For me, it's typically either my elbow or just above my elbow, in the area closer to my hand, if that makes sense. So, or just, I should say, just below my elbow. My arm is out straight. So I like to do that because it still gives me a good range of motion, a good radius on my arm. If you rest your arm too far down, closer to your hand, you're not going to have enough range of motion to really decorate properly. I personally do not need to brace my piping hand, but a lot of people, even expert advanced cookiers, will brace their piping hand with their other hand. So I'm right-handed, which means I would place my left hand, a finger either on my palm or on the piping bag itself. That's also something you can do if you have kind of a shaky hand. I just have, I think, a naturally not shaky hand, and I feel like I have more range of motion when I don't brace it with my left hand. So I just use the table. And then, as I was saying earlier, the way that you actually pipe the lines is you have to lift the bag off of the cookie surface. So it's kind of hard to see at this angle, but if you really focus, you can tell that I'm lifting that bag. And it depends. I might lift it anywhere from a quarter of an inch to half an inch, to maybe even up to an inch, depending on what I'm doing. Up to an inch I usually do for more like curved continuous lines. That's really the secret to a straight line. I think these were really hard straight lines for me, so I probably only lifted it about a quarter of an inch because I was going really slowly. And you really have to figure out the perfect medium of how much pressure to apply in your bag based on the thickness of your icing, and then how fast to move your bag. So it's a lot of things to think about. If you struggle with lines, I would suggest trying on a piece of paper first, maybe print out just a series of lines, or even if you have lined notebook paper, just practice tracing those lines. I would say starting it is, after you get a straight line, then figuring out how to start it is the next hardest part. And a lot of people struggle with having a bead at the beginning of the line. I would not focus on that at the beginning. Just focus on getting a straight line. If you have a bead, it's fine. The bead is the next step. Okay, let me figure out how to get rid of the bead at the beginning of the line. And again, a lot of that is just knowing how much pressure to apply on your bag and how fast to move your bag. to get rid of that bead, you really need to move quickly. So the millisecond that you contact that surface with the bag, you pull it up, pull it off of the surface. The longer you leave that bag touching the surface with the icing, the bigger that beginning bead is going to get. So every few lines, I am actually cleaning off the tip of my bag because I find that it gets a little extra icing on the tip sometimes. And since I'm being so meticulous with the beginnings of my lines here, I want to make sure that I don't have any extra icing on the beginning of that line. So I think I'm going to leave you here staring at these lines, and I'll come back when they're done. Whew, last line. That was a doozy, but I love this cookie so much, so worth it. Next up is this one-tone brush embroidery. I've done a lot of brush embroidery in my day, but I've never done a single tone. This was very exciting for me. When I say single tone, that means that I'm doing the same color in the brush embroidery as the base of the cookie. So as I have done with the previous cookie, I am outlining and flooding with one consistency. Get a ton of questions about how to color such dark icing. I'll admit this was a mishmash of colors, but generally to get a dark green like this, I'm starting with kind of a standard green color out of the tube, adding a little extra blue, and black is the key. Just add a little bit at a time until you start to get the hue that you're looking for. It's also really important to let dark colors develop. Please let them develop. Developing means just letting them sit and they will darken on their own. Even in just 30 minutes, it will get darker, but 30 minutes, 1 hour, 6 hours overnight is even better when you're doing these really dark cookies, dark colors. So I was just going for dramatic effect there, letting it settle and using my scribe just to give it a little bit of extra encouragement. So I allowed that to quite significantly crust, and I'm going in piping with this medium peak piping consistency. And I like to have a really thick border line when I do brush embroidery. It's just, I suppose, personal opinion. And I'm using a rounded, squared brush here, and I'm just pulling at the icing. I'm probably pulling at about half of the thickness of that line. If you pull too much, you'll lose the definition of the beginning of that line. If you don't pull enough, then you won't get quite enough of the brush texture. Sometimes it's intentional for effect if you want more or less brush texture. It's up to you. It's up to the design that you're doing. To get that thicker line like I'm doing, I'm applying a lot of pressure, but I could also just potentially pipe one line and then pipe another line right next to it, whatever you're more comfortable doing. And my brush is damp when I'm doing this, so I dip it in water and then I lightly dry it off on a paper towel. And for me, I find that works best. But if your brush is too damp, you're not going to get the definition in the brush strokes. It's just going to look smooth. So again, that's kind of a balance, but I do often clean off the brush in between sections. And yes, another great way to do this is if you did these lines in white, then it would look like snow. Absolutely. I was just going for a monotone look because that's what I wanted for this cookie. But white would be beautiful too for some snow effect. And that is the brush embroidery tree. Up next, we have the crinkled parchment tree. So as always, as I've been doing, this is a 1 consistency outline and flood. Now I'm going to be adding a good amount of other icing on top of this as a wet on wet. So I'm quite intentionally going to very under flood this base. If I were to normally flood this base and then add all of this icing on top of it, it would definitely fall over the edges. I also want to not quite flood all the way to the edge since I'm using this parchment paper technique. When you press down with the parchment paper, it will squish the icing a little bit. So give yourself a couple millimeters on the edge. It's a little hard to tell here, but I did not flood all the way to the edge. You could certainly do this technique without this wet on wet. I've done it without the wet on wet, but I wanted to mix things up a little and give it a little design before I did the parchment paper, going in with here with my favorite scribe just to kind of blend it together, mess it up a little bit. There we go. I kind of hit the surface of the cookie. It's best when you're using a scribe for wet on wet to not actually touch the cookie. You're just dipping into the surface of the icing. And I felt like I lost a little bit too much of that base green that I was going for, so I just went in and added a little more and used my scribe to kind of help blend it in again. Now this parchment paper I'm using, I crumpled this twice. I crumple it once, I open it up, turn it inside out, and crumple it the other way, just to get what I think is a good base of crumple. And I like to press from the inside out. You want to make sure that you are pressing all the way to the edge of the cookie so you get the shape of the cookie. And then pressing from the outside in kind of, I think, helps best to prevent against too many air bubbles. I think some air bubbles are totally fine. It's part of the effect. So I let this dry overnight. You must allow this icing to completely dry. And you can see I definitely have some air bubbles in here. Totally fine. It's kind of a messy, funky look. And this here is the Sugar Art Sterling Pearl in Wedding Gold mixed with Everclear. I'm using my favorite detail brush here. I will link all of these products in the description of the video. And I just wanted a little extra something with some gold. There's no rhyme or reason to how I'm painting it on right now. Just wanted something extra. And there we have the crumpled parchment tree. So up next is the etched plaid cookie. Just like the other ones, I'm doing a 1 consistency outline and flood on this cookie. It's really important when doing a single consistency to still do a thinner outline. And since this is a flood consistency, I'm barely applying any pressure on this bag. It's mostly just falling out. And I'm guiding it. And then I go in and I apply, I would say, medium pressure to get a thicker outline here to hug the original outline. I don't want to over flood that part. And then I do apply more pressure at this point to get more icing into the center of the cookie. But there really is a lot of balance, practice to get the amount of icing just right so it doesn't fall off of the cookie. This needs just a little bit of encouragement to settle. I do actually stick the scribe into the surface of the cookie to get it to jiggle like that. I've allowed this to completely dry. That is super important with this technique. The icing needs to totally dry. I'm using a ruler here. This is the first time I've ever used a ruler with a cookie. And I'm using my favorite scribe here. There is a bit of an art, I think, to how much pressure to apply. If you apply too much pressure, you're really going to dig in to the icing and really create crevices instead of these beautiful clean lines. If you don't apply enough pressure, then it's really just more like a very superficial kind of scrape across the cookie. If that's what you're going for, that's great. For this, I really wanted to make sure that these lines were the star. So something that happens for me when I do this technique is I love the white that it looks right now. But keep in mind that the icing is not actually white underneath that. It's just something in the etching of it that makes it look white. I'm not using anything to make it look white. But I have found, and I don't understand this because it doesn't always happen, but more often than not, I wake up the next morning and find that the lines are no longer white. They're the color of the icing. So it's much less pronounced. So after I'm done doing the lines, I want to make sure they stay white. So I'm actually going to press in some white edible powder into the lines so that they actually stay white. But first, I'm going to finish up these lines. So onto the powder. Again, I will link this. I would actually recommend using a stiffer brush than I use because you really need to get the icing into the crevices. Especially with white, there's something with the white. If you don't really get it in there enough, you will still the next morning wake up to find that the lines and the white have really faded. This was just good enough, but I definitely needed to apply a lot of powder with that softer brush to get it into the crevices. It does kind of cover the whole cookie and make it look sort of chalkboardy, but I really like the effect. So it's good with me. If you don't mind the lines no longer being white, then you don't need to do this step. But I think it's cool. It's different. I'm a fan. So that's the etched plaid. And then up next are the wet on wet trees. They're so cute. So for this first step, I'm actually outlining the cookie first in medium peak piping consistency. I don't do this a lot, but I'm doing this specifically because I'm going to be doing wet on wet, and especially with a larger cookie surface, I just prefer to do 2 consistency for wet on wet. I feel a little safer, like the icing is less likely to fall over the edge. But then also, I find with wet on wet, it's easier to work with if your base is a little bit thinner. It obviously would need to be thicker if you're doing a 1 consistency outline and flood. So this just gives me a little more flexibility. The icing won't crust quite as quickly if it's thinner. So I'm keeping in mind that I am adding a wet on wet design on top of this, so I don't want to flood too much. I'm not adding that much icing though with the design I have in mind, so I don't need to under flood it quite significantly. Just enough is just right. So immediately I'm going in and I'm piping these trees. With wet on wet, you have to move very quickly. So it's good also to kind of plan out what exactly you're doing before you start flooding that cookie, because you really don't have much time to think. You just need to do. Especially with my icing, it tends to crust pretty quickly because I do not use corn syrup. I use a more standard royal icing that does not include corn syrup. So I'm going to allow this to completely dry. That's really important. And yes, I switched the cookie. Your eyes are not doing tricks on you. Here I am again using that Sugar Art Sterling Pearl and Wedding Gold mixed with Everclear, using that detail brush. This is not a super precise design, another reason why I like it. So just kind of zigzag away to get that in there. It's most important that this is completely dry for this next step. So I allow that wedding gold to dry, and then I'm using this brush, or excuse me, pen, this edible pen. And it's a pretty sharp tip, so if your icing is not completely dry, it is super easy to poke through the surface. I've definitely done it. Beware. It's a little overkill, I think, to do the gold and the pen. You could certainly do one or the other, but I was feeling it, so I went for it all. This next thing I'm doing, adding these dots in the negative space, is a pretty common technique people use to just kind of help finish off a design that might otherwise look not quite finished because there's just too much empty space. There is something to be said, though, to keeping something simple with empty space, but in this case, I thought that the dots really helped finish it off. And that is the wet on wet tree. Up next, we have the Crackle technique tree. So first up, I am outlining and flooding, of course. And once I am done flooding, I'm going to leave the cookie in the dehydrator for 15 minutes to just get the right amount of crust for this crackle. You definitely need to experiment in your own environment for how long you need to allow the base to dry before you start poking at it. If you allow it to dry less time, then it will be more of a soft indentation. If you allow it to dry more, it's going to be more of a jagged crackle. For this, I wanted more crackle than soft indentation, so 15 minutes works about for me, but I'm using a dehydrator. It's also kind of less humid right now in winter time, so if you're living in a more humid environment, you're going to need to allow it to dry longer. If you're using a fan to dry instead of a dehydrator, you'll need to allow it to dry longer. So what I typically do is I put the cookies wherever I'm allowing them to dry, and then I set a timer. For me, I know that it's about 15 minutes, so once 15 minutes hits, then I will test a little corner of one cookie, see where it is. If it's good, I move forward. If it needs a little more time, then I put it back. And here I'm using a fondant ball tool, but for the longest time, I just used the end of a paintbrush, and that is totally fine. You want something rounded at the end though, so you can get kind of the round crack. And when doing this, you want to make sure you're not actually puncturing the surface of the icing. You'll know that you've punctured it if you have icing on the end of your tool. So it's definitely, as always, there's an art to everything, and there's an art to applying just the right amount of pressure here. So once I have done that, I allowed that to dry a bit more, and I am piping these dots on the top. I am going to use a scribe to kind of help them settle a little bit better. You can kind of see a vein running through the cookie. If you can see that kind of towards the left, right above where I'm piping right now. And that is because I was a little too rough with this cookie before I allowed the surface to crust enough. So the very lightly crusted surface of the icing kind of moved a little bit because there was too much wet icing underneath it. I was not keeping it level, something like that, as I was moving the cookie. So that happens a lot, especially when you're a beginner and you're getting used to handling the cookies. So just keep that in mind. I allow this to dry even more. Ooh, after I do this one more dot. Felt like it needed it. I'm going to allow this to dry more before moving on to the next step, which is to paint on, again, this wedding gold. I'm using a pretty thick application and a pretty dense amount of powder versus Everclear. You really just need to experiment with how much liquid you're using based on the powder. You can always add more liquid, keep that in mind. I like to use a dropper to add my Everclear to my powder. I'm using the lid of the container here, and the second I started using it, I regretted it. But the ship had sailed, and so here I am. It's better, I think, to use, if you have any extra separate clear little containers that you can reuse with the same color in it. There's always going to be some left over. It will dry, and then you can just reuse that powder that's left in the little container that you've used. I'm just kind of dabbing it in with this because I wanted a really thick application. I found that if I was kind of painting it more, that it made the application too thin. And there we have the crackle technique. Up next is the flat parchment paper with etched snowflakes. So here I am, the classic one consistency, outline and flood. Once I'm done flooding this, I will immediately apply a flat piece of parchment paper. There's not too much of an art to applying it, but you do want to get as even of a coverage as possible. Use a clean piece of parchment paper, please. Nothing that you've used to bake cookies on. And you'll want this to dry completely before you pull off the parchment. I know it looks like a magic trick in a second because it looks like it happens instantaneously, but believe me, if you try to pull off the parchment before the icing has completely dried, it will look like a hot mess express. You don't want that. I allow mine to dry overnight. I just leave them out on a cookie sheet. You do not want to cover royal icing before it has completely dried. It is not your friend. Leave it out on a cookie sheet. Let it dry. You can kind of tell by touching it in the morning if it's completely dry or not. And it should very easily, just like this, come right off. So you can see there's a little bit of an overhang of my icing, but that's okay. This technique is a little more rugged, so I'm cool with it. Just like I did with the other etched cookie, I'm using a ruler here and my scribe. Same amount of pressure, and I will be etching out these snowflakes. Again, to keep those snowflakes white, I am applying more white powder, and in this case, I just did it around the snowflake. I kind of feel like it makes it glow against the rest of the cookie, and for this, I do think that this softer brush was the right applicator, so I can get kind of this glowiness around the snowflake, instead of, say, more jagged lines or something with a stiffer brush. And that is the etched snowflake. Up next, we have the patterned wet on wet. And again, like I did with the other wet on wet cookie, I am outlining first with a piping consistency before I actually go in with the flood consistency. I do allow my outline typically to dry a bit before applying the flood consistency. I do think this is kind of the safer way to go about it. It has more integrity to the outline. It kind of holds the icing in better, but in this case I actually went in and flooded immediately for the sake of this video. It worked out fine, but when I'm doing more than one cookie at a time, I definitely allow the outline to dry first. So I'm doing a pretty extensive wet on wet design here with different colors. So instead of flooding the entire base and then applying more icing on top of that, there really is no one base color with this. It's just a pattern of different colors. So I'm just doing one at a time, as you can see here, and I will fill in the entire base of the cookie with flood consistency, but in a pattern instead of just one color. As always with wet on wet, super important to move really fast here. I do find it a little harder when doing something like this to really gauge how much icing I need to put on the surface here. I'm so used to flooding from the outside in, and I kind of know well how much pressure I need. Just something to keep in mind as you're doing this. It was also kind of stressful, honestly, to get clean curves here, and this entire design kind of relied on a clean flood here, but I just let it go. It's good enough. It's not perfect, and that's okay. So once I'm done flooding, I allow that to completely dry. Again, that's really important. I'm using this edible pen with a very sharp end, and I don't want to poke through. So I was just going with some fun, funky little pattern sketches here. Just something to add to the design of the cookie. Y'all know I like to add a little extra something every once in a while, and in this case I wanted some gold to add to this design, so I'm just doing that same wedding gold sterling pearl with Everclear, and I'm using this fine detail brush from Chua Cookie. It's so cute. It's a mermaid tail. It's fabulous. I highly recommend it, and I will link it in the description of this video. And there we have the wet on wet pattern tree. Up next is what I am lovingly calling the puffy teardrop cookie. So first up, I am outlining and flooding. Same old, same old. I'll leave you here for a minute, and I'll be back when this is dry. So I have let that base almost completely dry. I want to make sure I'm working with a solid base that I'm not going to poke through. And this here is a soft peak piping consistency. That part is super important. This technique is not really going to work if you're using something too thin or too thick. A medium peak wouldn't really allow these teardrops to settle out into something smooth and soft like they are. I'm using the pressure piping technique here, which means I'm varying the amount of pressure on my bag, and that's how I'm getting the larger amount at first. So I apply a lot of pressure, and as I release the pressure, I'm also pulling the bag away. So it definitely takes a good amount of coordination here. It's more or less piping a bead and pulling away, but you need to still apply pressure as you're pulling away. It's not like the normal kind of teardrop pressure pipe dots where it's really just a dot and then pull away. This is a dot continuing to apply pressure as you're pulling away, but letting go at the same time. It's a lot to think about. I just really loved this design. I saw this concept first from Downtown Dotio, Megan Warren. She's brilliant, totally brilliant. And I'm using a swivel here. I don't use swivels a lot, but I was doing a pretty intricate design here, and I wanted to make sure I was always decorating at the ideal angle. So that's what this swivel allows me to do. I was also just making this up as I went, to be quite honest. I knew I wanted to start with that initial line, and I knew I wanted a couple of clusters of really big teardrops like the ones I did in the lower left corner. But then after that, I was just eyeing it to kind of see what the flow was and what I wanted to do from there. So I've allowed those teardrops to dry completely. That's really important. When applying gold, you want to make sure that what you're painting on top of has dried. Otherwise, you may be left with some not so nice craters. Not fun. And I'm using a pretty thick application here. Again, sometimes I find with this brand of edible metallics that I need to use 2 coats. I really did not have the patience on this one to do more than 1 coat. 1 coat was enough patience. So I applied it pretty thick, cross my fingers it was thick enough so I wouldn't have to go back, and it worked just fine. And again, using the cap here, I do not recommend using the cap. The best thing to do is on Amazon, you can buy some empty, clear little screw top containers, and you can use that to mix your color each time. Only use the same color in each container, but that allows you to reuse what was left, because it's almost impossible to use up every bit of gold every time that you mix it. And there we have the puffy teardrop tree. Up next, we have the moss technique cookie. So first up, I'm doing the standard outline and flood with one consistency. And then immediately after I flood this, I'm going to apply the quote unquote moss. And all this is crushed up graham crackers. And then I took my food gel coloring, and I actually did a custom mix for the icing itself. For the coloring of the moss, I believe that I used a Maricolor forest green, and that might have been it, to be honest. What I did was I thinned out the gel food coloring with a bit of Everclear. That will evaporate and dry off, so don't worry about using alcohol. And I thinned that out just a bit so it was a little more liquid, and I put the crushed graham crackers into a Tupperware. You could also use a plastic bag, and I added the food gel coloring, and I just shook. And I applied a little by little just to get the desired color and make sure I had a good coating. You don't want to add too much of that liquid color because then your crumbs will get too wet. So I'm doing it this way just for the sake of this video, but please, for your sake, apply the graham cracker crumbs on top of a bowl. It will be so much neater, but I thought this looked nice for the video, so here we are. I have let this surface dry completely, and I wanted to add just a little extra design element. It's a little awkward piping on top of this moss. You want to make sure that you're really piping into it so that the dots adhere to everything. You also want to make sure that you have cleaned off any excess moss, because if there's too much excess, then you're just going to be piping on top of the excess, and then it's going to fall right off, which will be sad. So don't do that. This here is pressure piping these droplets, and this is a somewhere between soft and medium peak piping consistency. You pressure pipe a dot and then pull away and release pressure at the same time. And there we have the moss technique. Up next is the painted gingham. This is kind of a simple design, but took me a surprising amount of time. So as always, first up, outlining and flooding with one consistency, and I will leave you here and come back when it's dry. Now that this flood coat is dry, I am actually painting on top with icing. So you can see in the corner of this video, I actually have a little piece of parchment that I have squirted out a bunch of icing. I did have to do that in stages. You don't want to squirt it all out at the beginning because it will crust over as you're starting to paint. This is a pretty messy painting job, and I'm totally cool with it. You could make it look a lot cleaner with a lot less icing, but I was going for texture with this set, so I was happy with this look. And I am going to just keep painting while it's wet, even on the cross sections. I'm using a swivel here just so I can always be painting from left to right on my lines in the way that I'm most comfortable doing it. I'm obviously eyeing it here, but if you needed a guide, I would recommend using a ruler and a scribe to just etch the lines very lightly on top, and then you can use that as a guide as you're actually painting it. So I do think it's important to make sure you're doing your cross lines while the other ones are still wet, so you can kind of drag through it. And then once the painted bits are dry, I'm using this Wedding Gold again with a fine detail brush, and I'm just painting through the center. It gets a little wonky at times, painting across some of the elevated texture, but it's all part of the look, and I'm a fan. And there we have the painted gingham. Up next, we have what I am calling the wavy crackle tree. So first up, I am outlining with a piping consistency because this is going to be a wet on wet design, and safety first, friends. I'm joking, but this just gives me peace of mind to do the piping consistency outline first. Allow that to dry. I don't think I will in this case, just for the video, because I was doing it in one take. So now I'm going in with my flood consistency to do the design, and much like I did with that wet on wet wavy pattern earlier, I am just actually flooding the pattern itself and not doing a base layer. So again, for me, I let this dry in the dehydrator for 15 minutes. You'll need to experiment on your own with how much time you need based on your environment and how you dry your cookies. And again, I'm using the end of a fondant tool. It's a nice rounded end, and it has 2 different sizes on this tool, but you can definitely just use the end of a toothbrush. Excuse me, I keep saying toothbrush, paintbrush. And that works just fine. That is what I did for the longest time. And again, here you want to just crack the surface, not puncture it. And I am cleaning off my tool in between just to make sure that I'm not getting any icing on the end of my tool, because if I do, then I will just spread that icing through the rest of the design, which is not the goal here. And once I allow that to dry a bit more, I'm now just piping some detail waves on top, just because. And this is a soft peak piping consistency. And since I'm doing wavy lines here, as I mentioned earlier, I'm pulling that bag pretty far off the surface and guiding my icing to get these beautiful curves. So this is definitely about 1/2 inch off the cookie. Super important when trying to pipe lines like this. And there we have the wavy crackle. Up next is the bear technique. First up, of course, outlining and flooding. This is a standard outline and flood, so I'm going to leave you here and I'll be back when it dries. I've allowed this surface to completely dry. That's really important when doing this bear technique because you don't want to puncture through your surface. And I wanted to play around with the bear technique and use some different colors instead of just doing one, which is most often used. There's really no rhyme or reason to what I'm doing right now, just piping this out. It's all somewhere between a soft and a medium peak piping consistency. Just making sure that I get good coverage with different colors. There's a balance between just the right amount of icing, not too much, not too little. And I like to use a wide end brush. Some people use other kinds of tools. I was really going for as much texture and lift as possible. So I was a little heavier on the icing, and I'm not trying to mat this in too much. This is really just an up-down motion. Kind of blending these together, trying to do one color at first before I start blending because I wanted there to still be difference in between the different colors, not just one mesh of 3 colors. And I'm cleaning off my brush in between. And then after I get all these sections done, Now I'm going through with my dirty brush and I'm just kind of helping it kind of blend together a little bit better. This cookie's actually kind of bouncing up and down, which is why I have to keep holding it. It does not want to stay in place when I'm doing this technique. And now to add a little extra pizzazz, I'm using the Sugar Art White Diamond Dust. I put it on top of a paper towel because y'all, this glitter gets everywhere. It's a pain to clean up. So do yourself a favor, do it on top of a paper towel, and you're good to go. Ooh, a little more glitter. Y'all, I always need more glitter. So that's the bear technique. And then up next, actually, this is the last cookie. We have the peace cookie. There's a little surprise at the end of this. I love doing this really elegant writing across a cookie. This is just an image that I found on the internet of a writing that I liked. And I'm doing the standard outline and flood here. So again, I will leave you here until it dries. So I've allowed this to dry, and now I'm using my Wedding Gold Pretty Wet application on the end of a brush and just tapping on top of a paper towel. Do this on top of a paper towel. Again, this is a messy technique and you do not want to be cleaning up this metallic. So this is the surprise, friends. I did one take, I didn't check it, and it didn't focus. I'm using a projector here. I'm projecting a font onto this cookie. I left this in here just as a teaching moment. No one's perfect. We all make mistakes. I should have checked my video. I should have done more than one take, but I didn't. And here we are. So I like to leave these real moments in these real-time tutorials because I think it just shows you the whole process and what happens. It's still a beautiful cookie, a very peaceful cookie. And that is the entire set of 16 trees. I hope you have fun making some of these yourself.